Look at the person sitting across from you. Their hair curls where yours falls straight. It shines black where yours goes blonde in the summer. It grows in tight coils where yours grows in loose waves. You've probably never questioned it. Hair is just hair. But the real answer is far stranger than you think, because that single strand on your head is carrying a story that starts hundreds of thousands of years ago, written by sunlight, migration, and survival itself. Every hair on your body grows out of a tiny structure called a follicle, and the shape of that follicle is the entire secret. A round follicle produces a straight strand, an oval follicle produces a wave, a flattened, curved follicle produces a tight curl. That's it. That's the whole mechanical difference between stick-straight hair and springy coils. Not different substances, not different types of protein. Just geometry carved into your skin by genetics that trace back to where your ancestors lived. Look closely enough and the pattern holds across every population on Earth. Slice a straight hair strand under a microscope and it's nearly a perfect circle. Slice a tightly coiled strand and it's flattened, almost ribbon-shaped, twisting on itself as it grows. That twist isn't random. It's encoded, generation after generation, by the exact curvature of the follicle it came from. Change the follicle shape even slightly, and the strand that grows out of it changes with it, predictably, every single time. So why would evolution bother shaping a follicle at all? Why would something as small as a strand of hair matter enough to be shaped by survival? Anthropologist Nina Jablonski has spent decades studying how human skin and hair evolved in response to the sun, and her research points to something remarkable. Hair texture isn't cosmetic, it's climate control. Picture equatorial Africa, tens of thousands of years ago. The sun is relentless, overhead almost every day of the year. Early humans there needed a way to protect the scalp from direct radiation while still letting heat escape from the body, because overheating the brain is a fast way to die. Tightly coiled hair does something straight hair simply cannot. It creates loft, space between the scalp and the outside air. That gap acts like natural insulation, but in reverse. It doesn't trap heat in, it blocks the sun's radiation from cooking the scalp directly, while still allowing airflow to carry heat away from the body. Biological anthropologist Tina Lasisi ran experiments specifically testing this. Using human hair samples of varying curl patterns fitted onto mannequin heads under heat lamps simulating direct sunlight, she measured scalp temperature underneath. The tightly curled samples kept the scalp significantly cooler than straight hair did, under exactly the same conditions. Curl pattern wasn't a side effect of anything. It was solving a life-or-death thermal problem. Now travel north. Follow early human populations as they migrated out of Africa into higher latitudes, into northern Europe, into Scandinavia. The sun there is weaker, less direct, less punishing. The advantage of scalp cooling matters less, but a new problem appears instead. Not enough sunlight reaching the skin at all. Your body needs sunlight to produce vitamin D. In regions with weak, low-angle sun, every bit of exposure counts. Straight hair lying flat against the scalp doesn't block light the way tightly coiled hair does. It lets more of that scarce sunlight interact with the skin underneath. Without enough vitamin D, bones don't develop properly. Immune function weakens. In a world without supplements or fortified food, this wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a slow, compounding disadvantage, passed down through generations who struggled to absorb enough light in places where the sun barely climbed above the horizon for months at a time. Any trait that let a little more sunlight reach the skin carried real, measurable value. This is where hair color enters the story, and it follows almost exactly the same logic. Melanin, the pigment responsible for hair and skin color, comes in two main forms. One produces black and brown tones. The other, found in much smaller amounts, produces red and blonde tones. Near the equator, high melanin production protected skin from UV damage, and that same pigment darkened the hair along with it, as a side effect of the same genetic system. But in low sunlight regions, heavy pigmentation became a liability instead of a shield. Populations with lighter skin and lighter hair could absorb more of the limited UV available, producing enough vitamin D to prevent serious bone and immune problems. Over thousands of generations, lighter hair and skin spread through northern European populations, not by accident, but because it kept people alive and reproducing in an environment starving for sunlight. Genetic researchers studying variation in the human genome have traced blonde hair in northern Europe to mutations in a specific gene, one that reduces melanin production. That single genetic switch, flipped and then favored by natural selection over tens of thousands of years, is a large part of why blonde hair exists at all. Red hair follows its own strange path. It's linked to variants in a gene called MC1R, and unlike most traits shaped primarily by climate, red hair may have persisted partly through simple genetic chance in small, relatively isolated populations, where a rare variant can spread simply because the group breeding together was small enough for randomness to matter. Evolution isn't always a perfectly engineered solution. Sometimes it's a coin flip that happened to land the same way often enough to stick. Here's the twist that makes this whole story even stranger. One of the clearest examples of hair texture variation comes down to a single gene called EDAR. A specific variant of this gene, extremely common across East Asian populations, produces thicker hair strands and straighter texture. Geneticists studying this variant traced its rapid spread to a mutation that appeared roughly 30,000 years ago, and it didn't just change hair. The same gene variant also affects sweat gland density and tooth shape, which means your hair texture right now might be genetically tangled up with completely unrelated traits, all riding on the same piece of DNA, all shaped by whatever pressures pushed that one mutation to spread so successfully through an entire population. Think about what that means. You didn't get your hair texture and color from one clean, isolated decision made by evolution. You got it from an overlapping tangle of climate adaptation, sunlight scarcity, genetic drift, and mutations that hitchhiked alongside completely different traits, all compressed into strands growing out of your scalp right now. And none of this stopped when your ancestors settled into cities and stopped following the sun's intensity across continents. Human populations have been mixing, migrating, and intermarrying for thousands of years, especially in the last few centuries. That's why you can have two siblings with completely different hair textures. That's why hair type in many populations today doesn't map neatly onto any single ancestral region anymore. The genetic instructions are still following the old evolutionary logic, even as the reasons behind that logic have completely changed. A child born today might carry follicle genes shaped by equatorial sun on one side of their family tree and pigmentation genes shaped by Scandinavian winters on the other, blended into a single head of hair that no ancient population ever actually had. There was no evolutionary blueprint for that exact combination. There didn't need to be. The underlying rules, curl for cooling, pigment for protection, pigment loss for absorption, simply kept applying themselves to whatever genetic material showed up, generation after generation, indifferent to the borders humans would eventually draw on maps. There's something almost humbling in that. The thing you fuss over in the mirror every morning, the thing entire industries exist to straighten, curl, dye, and reshape, was never actually about appearance at all. It was about keeping a brain cool enough to think and skin exposed enough to survive. Every product marketed to change your hair is, in a strange sense, fighting against a system that was built with extraordinary precision for a world that no longer exists in the same way. Climate control systems, engineered by hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error, sitting quietly on top of your head, mostly ignored, until someone finally explains what they were built for. So the next time you look at someone whose hair curls differently than yours, or catches a different color in the sunlight, understand what you're actually looking at. Not a cosmetic difference, not a random accident. A physical record of where an ancestor once stood on this planet, how strong the sun was overhead, and what their body needed to do to survive it. Look at the person sitting across from you. Their hair is nothing like yours. That's not a coincidence. That's geography, written in keratin, still growing out of both your heads today.